Chapter 1. The Peculiar Note. The winter of 1889 brought with it a bitterness that seemed to seep through the very walls of London. Icy winds howled down Baker Street as I huddled near the crackling fire in the sitting room I shared with my dear friend Sherlock Holmes. Outside, a blanket of fog had descended upon the city, transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly apparitions and muffling the sounds of hansoms clattering over the cobblestones below. Holmes had been in a restless mood for several days, pacing our quarters like a caged tiger, his keen mind clearly suffering from the lack of stimulation that came between cases. His violin lay untouched, and the morning papers had been discarded with unusual contempt. Even his chemical experiments, which typically provided him some distraction during these periods of inactivity, had been abandoned. "Watson," he said suddenly, dropping into his armchair opposite mine, "do you not find it curious that in a city of nearly 5 million souls, not one person has managed to commit a crime of sufficient intrigue to warrant our attention?" I smiled at his characteristic impatience. "Perhaps the criminal classes have taken a holiday, Holmes. Or perhaps they're simply deterred by this dreadful weather. Criminals, like the post, are seldom deterred by mere inclement weather." Higi-ur replied with a dismissive wave. "No, Watson. I fear we are experiencing an unprecedented drought of intellectual challenge." As if in direct response to his lament, the doorbell rang with an urgency that suggested our visitor had not come for a social call. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded on the stairs moments later, followed by a gentle knock at our door. "A messenger for you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, handing my friend a small envelope before retreating downstairs. Holmes examined the envelope with his characteristic attention to detail, turning it over in his long fingers before carefully opening it. His eyebrows rose fractionally as he read its contents, a subtle gesture that I had learned to recognize as a sign of genuine interest. "Well, Watson," he said, passing me the note, "it seems our drought has ended. The handwriting was elegant yet hurried, the ink still relatively fresh. Mr. Holmes, I implore you to come at once to Thornfield Manor in Surrey. My sister has been murdered in a locked room by what the local police insist is impossible means. They speak of suicide, but I know this to be false. The circumstances are beyond peculiar. She was found dead before a mirror that appears to have killed her not once, but twice. I fear I shall be next. Please help. Yours desperately, Miss Eliza Blackwood, killed twice," I asked, looking up from the note. What could that possibly mean? Holmes was already on his feet, energy radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely why we must go. Pack your bag for a few days' journey. We shall catch the next train to Surrey." Within the hour, we were settled in a first-class compartment, racing through the fog-shrouded countryside. Holmes sat in silence, his sharp profile outlined against the window, fingers steepled beneath his chin in that familiar pose of deep contemplation. "Have you formed any theories yet?" I ventured after some time. "To theorize before one has data is a capital mistake," he replied, though his eyes sparkled with the excitement of the chase. "But I will say this, the mention of a mirror is intriguing. Reflective surfaces have featured prominently in numerous superstitions and folklore throughout history. The Romans believed breaking a mirror brought 7 years of misfortune. In medieval Europe, mirrors were covered during illness and death, lest they trap the soul of the dying. Surely you don't believe in such superstitions, Holmes? He smiled thinly. Of course not. But behind most superstitions lies a kernel of observable truth, however misinterpreted. What interests me is not the supernatural implications, but the psychological ones. Mirrors distort reality, or rather, they present reality from a perspective we rarely witness otherwise. They can be disorienting, confusing, and confusion, Watson, is the soil in which crime often takes root. We arrived at the small Surrey station by late afternoon. A carriage awaited us, sent by Miss Blackwood herself. The driver, a grim-faced fellow who offered little conversation beyond confirming that he would take us directly to Thornfield Manor. The journey took us through winding country lanes and finally up a long tree-lined drive. Thornfield Manor emerged from the mist like a spectre, a grand Victorian edifice of grey stone and tall windows that seemed to watch us approach with malevolent intent. Ivy climbed its walls like grasping fingers, and the gardens, once clearly magnificent, now bore the neglected look of recent tragedy. As we pulled up before the entrance, the massive oak door swung open to reveal a woman dressed in mourning black, her face pale and drawn, with what I recognized as both grief and fear. She couldn't have been more than 30 years of age, but sorrow had added years to her countenance. "Mr. Holmes?" she called, stepping forward anxiously. "And Dr. Watson. Thank heaven you've come. I am Eliza Blackwood." Holmes stepped down from the carriage with characteristic grace. "Miss Blackwood, I received your note. May I offer my condolences for your loss?" "Thank you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, come inside quickly. There are things I must tell you. Things I dare not put in writing." As we followed her into the dimly lit entrance hall, I noticed her glancing nervously at every reflective surface we passed. A polished silver tray on a side table, a small decorative mirror on the wall. Each one seemed to cause her visible distress. "The mirror," Holmes said quietly, as we handed our coats to a solemn-faced butler. "The one you mentioned in your note. May we see it?" Miss Blackwood's face drained of what little colour it had retained. "It's in Catherine's room, my sister's room. I've had it locked since they took her body away. No one has entered. I couldn't bear to see it again." "Understandable," Holmes said with uncharacteristic gentleness. "But if we are to help, we must examine everything, the mirror most of all." She nodded, though her entire body seemed to tremble at the prospect. "Of course, but first, tea in the drawing room, if you please. The journey was long, and I need a moment to prepare myself before returning to that room." As we followed her through the winding corridors of Thornfield Manor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Not just by the portraits of stern-faced Blackwood, ancestors that lined the walls, but by something else. Something hidden within the very fabric of this house of shadows and secrets. Little did I know then that the case of the mirror that killed twice would prove to be one of the strangest and most perilous adventures in my long association with Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 2. Thornfield's Shadows. The drawing room of Thornfield Manor was a study in faded elegance. Heavy velvet curtains kept the waning daylight at bay, while a modest fire cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with hunting scenes and family portraits. Miss Blackwood gestured for us to take seats near the hearth as a maid silently delivered a tea service. "I must apologize for the state of things," Miss Blackwood said, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "Since Catherine's death, I've dismissed most of the staff. Only Mrs. Winters the housekeeper, Jenkins the butler, and 2 maids remain." Holmes accepted his cup with a nod. "Tell us about your sister, Miss Blackwood, and the circumstances of her death." Something flickered across Eliza Blackwood's face, a complex emotion I couldn't quite decipher. Catherine was vibrant, 4 years my junior at 26, but always the more spirited of us. Our parents died in a railway accident when she was still in school, leaving me as her guardian and the mistress of Thornfield. She paused, gathering herself. 3 nights ago, she retired to her room after dinner, in seemingly good spirits. The next morning her maid found her. "And the room was locked?" Holmes inquired, his keen eyes never leaving our hostess. "Yes. From the inside, the key was still in the lock. Jenkins had to break down the door when the maid raised the alarm." "And the local police? Their conclusions?" Miss Blackwood's lips tightened. "Inspector Graves from Guildford suggested suicide, though he could not explain the peculiar," Shide faltered, "the peculiar manner of her death." Holmes finished for her. "You mentioned in your note a mirror that killed her twice. I confess I find the phrasing most intriguing." Miss Blackwood set down her cup with such force that tea sloshed onto the saucer. "It defies explanation, Mr. Holmes. Catherine was found on the floor before her dressing-table mirror. Her throat had been cut, a single deep laceration." Her voice grew hollow, but her reflection in the mirror showed a different wound entirely. A stab wound to the heart, with blood patterns completely inconsistent with the actual body. I nearly choked on my tea. "That's impossible." "Improbable, perhaps," Holmes corrected, me, his expression animated with intellectual curiosity, "but clearly not impossible, as we have a witness to the phenomenon." He turned back to Miss Blackwood. "The mirror, is it an antique?" "Yes, it belonged to our grandmother. Catherine claimed it recently, having it moved from the attic to her room just last month." "And who discovered this discrepancy between body and reflection?" "I did." A shadow passed over Miss Blackwood's face. "The maid's screams woke me. I was first to enter after Jenkins forced the door. Inspector Graves didn't notice the different reflection until I pointed it out. By then, it had faded somewhat, but was still visible. He dismissed it as female hysteria, suggested grief was making me see things." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "The reflection faded, you say?" "Yes. By the time the doctor arrived an hour later, the reflection matched reality. The inspector used this as proof of my delusion." "I see." Holmes fell silent for a moment. "You mentioned in your note that you fear you might be next. Why?" Miss Blackwood's hands clasped tightly in her lap. "2 reasons. First, Catherine left me a note. I found it the day after her death, slipped under my door." She reached into her pocket and produced a folded paper, which she handed to Holmes. Holmes unfolded it carefully, and I leaned closer to read over his shoulder. "Dearest Eliza, it watches me from behind the glass. It is not my face that looks back anymore. If something happens to me, beware the mirrors. They are doorways, and something has come through. All my love, Catherine." "Most curious," Holmes murmured, examining the handwriting closely. "And the second reason?" Miss Blackwood's voice dropped to a whisper. "Since her death, I've been seeing things, glimpses in reflective surfaces. A face that is not my own, a hand reaching out." Her composure finally broke, tears spilling down her pale cheeks. "I know how it sounds, Mr. Holmes, but I am not mad. Something unnatural is happening in this house." Holmes rose abruptly. "I think it's time we examined your sister's room, Miss Blackwood, and most particularly this mirror." She nodded reluctantly and led us up a grand staircase to the east wing of the manor. The corridor was dimly lit by gas lamps that created pools of light amid lengthening shadows. At the end of the hall, she stopped before a door sealed with police tape. "Was Catherine's room," she said, producing a key from her pocket. "Inspector Graves finished his examination yesterday, but insisted I lock it until the inquest next week." As she unlocked the door, I noticed Holmes studying the floor, the door frame, and the ceiling with meticulous attention. The door swung open, with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the corridor. The room beyond was spacious, dominated by a large four-poster bed draped in midnight blue. A Persian carpet covered most of the floor, though a dark stain near the dressing table told its own grim story. The dressing table itself stood against the far wall, topped by an ornate mirror in a silver frame, adorned with intricate celestial motifs, stars, moons, and what appeared to be astrological symbols. Holmes approached it with measured steps, his reflection growing larger in the glass as he drew near. I found myself holding my breath, half expecting to see some supernatural discrepancy appear. "Most interesting," Holmes said, bending to examine the silver frame without touching it. "These symbols are not merely decorative. They appear to be a form of alchemical notation, mixed with astronomical symbols." He circled the dressing table, observing from every angle. "The mirror itself is unusual. The glass has a peculiar tint to it. Catherine claimed she could see more clearly in it than any other mirror," Miss Blackwood said from the doorway, unwilling to step fully into the room. "She became fascinated with it." Holmes knelt suddenly, examining the carpet beneath the dressing table. "Dr. Watson, your medical opinion, if you please." I joined him, noting what he had already observed, a pattern of small droplets leading from the large bloodstain toward the mirror. "These blood spatters," I began, "are inconsistent with a single throat wound. They suggest arterial spray from multiple directions." "Precisely," Holmes said with satisfaction. "And yet we are told the body showed only one wound." He rose, and she turned to Miss Blackwood. "I should like to speak with your staff, particularly the maid who discovered the body, and I shall need to examine your sister's correspondence and personal effects." "Of course," she replied, "whatever you need." As we prepared to leave the room, Holmes paused for one final look at the mirror. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw his reflection smile before he did, a subtle desynchronization that sent a chill up my spine. But when I blinked and looked again, all appeared normal. Outside in the corridor, Miss Blackwood locked the door with visible relief. "You'll stay the night, of course," she said. "I've had rooms prepared." "Thank you, Holmes. replied. "We shall require them, as I suspect this investigation may take longer than initially anticipated." As we followed her back toward the staircase, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that we were being observed, not by the living inhabitants of Thornfield Manor, but by something else entirely, something that lurked behind the silvered glass of an ancient mirror, waiting. Chapter 3. Whispers of the household dinner at Thornfield Manor was a subdued affair, served in a dining room that seemed too vast for 3 people. Miss Blackwood picked at her food while answering Holmes's casual questions about the estate's history. The manor, it seemed, had been in the Blackwood family for 5 generations, originally purchased by a great-grandfather who had made his fortune in India during the early days of the East India Company. And this great-grandfather, Holmes inquired, did he bring back items from his travels abroad? "Many," Miss Blackwood replied. "The attics are full of curiosities. Some have made their way into the house over the years, including several pieces of furniture, artwork, and—" Her voice faltered. "And mirrors?" Holmes suggested. She nodded. "Yes, including Catherine's mirror." After dinner, Holmes requested to interview the staff individually in the library. Jenkins, the butler, was first. A tall, gaunt man with the impeccable posture of one who had spent decades in service. "Jenkins," Holmes began once we were settled, "how long have you served the Blackwood family?" 32 years, sir," I began, "as a footman under the late Mr. Blackwood, the young lady's father." "And you were the one who broke down Miss Catherine's door?" "Yes, sir. When Mary, that's the upstairs maid, came screaming down the stairs that Miss Catherine wouldn't answer, I went up immediately. The door was locked from inside, as Miss Eliza has no doubt told you. I had no choice but to force it." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Jenkins, did you notice anything unusual about Miss Catherine's behaviour in the days before her death?" The butler hesitated, his professional mask slipping momentarily. "She had changed, sir, ever since that mirror came down from the attic." "Changed how?" "She became preoccupied, would spend hours at her dressing table. Sometimes I'd hear her talking when no one else was in the room." Jenkins' voice dropped, and she started covering all the mirrors in the house with cloths. Said she didn't like being watched. Holmes exchanged a glance with me before continuing. "And on the night of her death, did you observe anything out of the ordinary?" "Only that she seemed unusually cheerful at dinner, sir. Almost relieved, like someone who's made a difficult decision and found peace with it. Like someone contemplating suicide," I suggested quietly. Jenkins stiffened. "Begging your pardon, Dr. Watson, but Miss Catherine was not the suicidal type. Strong-willed she was. Whatever happened that night, I'll never believe she took her own life." After dismissing Jenkins, Holmes interviewed Mary, the maid who had discovered the body. She was a nervous girl of perhaps 19, twisting her apron in her hands as she recounted the discovery. "I brought Miss Catherine's morning tea as usual, sir. When she didn't answer my knock, I thought perhaps she was still asleep. It wasn't until I noticed the key in the lock from the inside that I grew concerned." She shuddered visibly. After Jenkins broke down the door, Miss Eliza rushed in first. The scream she let out, I'll never forget it. Miss Catherine was lying there, all that blood, and Miss Eliza kept pointing at the mirror, screaming about 2 deaths. "Did you look in the mirror yourself?" Holmes asked. Mary crossed herself, quickly. "No, sir. I couldn't bear to look at poor Miss Catherine, let alone her reflection. Besides, my mother always taught me that mirrors should be covered after a death, lest the soul be trapped." Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, proved more, pragmatic but equally disturbed by recent events. A robust woman in her 50s, with shrewd eyes, she confirmed that Catherine had been behaving oddly, but offered additional insights. Miss Catherine had visitors in the weeks before her death, she revealed. Most notably, Professor Hartwell from Oxford. Something to do with the history of objects from India, she said. And there was a letter. Arrived the very day before her death. She seemed most agitated after reading it. "Do you know where this letter might be?" Holmes asked immediately. "I imagine in her room, sir. Miss Catherine was methodical about her correspondence, always kept everything in the desk drawer. After the interviews concluded, Miss Blackwood provided us with oil lamps and bid us good night, her exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. As she retreated upstairs, Holmes turned to me with undisguised excitement. "We must return to Miss Catherine's room, Watson. I believe we may find crucial evidence there that Inspector Graves has overlooked." Using the key Miss Blackwood had provided, we re-entered the scene of the tragedy. The room seemed even more foreboding by lamplight, shadows stretching across the walls like grasping fingers. Holmes made directly for the small writing desk in the corner, opening its drawers with careful precision. "Ah," he murmured after a moment, extracting several letters bound with ribbon. "Correspondence from Professor Hartwell, just as Mrs. Winters suggested." He unfolded the most recent letter, dated just days before Catherine's death. "My dear Miss Blackwood, I have completed my research on the artifact you described, and I must urge caution. The mirror you possess bears striking similarities to the glass of Shiva, described in obscure Indian texts. Such mirrors were allegedly created by practitioners of tantric arts to communicate with the dead, or worse, with entities from beyond our understanding. The celestial markings you described are not merely decorative, but form an arcane invitation. According to legend, when the stars align in a particular configuration, the boundary between worlds grows thin, allowing passage through the glass. I strongly advise returning the mirror to storage until I can examine it personally. Do not use it, particularly during the new moon, which approaches in 3 days' time. With sincere concern, Edward Hartwell, Ph.D. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed upon reading over Holmes's shoulder. "Surely you don't believe in such supernatural nonsense?" Holmes's expression remained impassive. "I believe in evidence, Watson. And while I am skeptical of occult explanations, this letter establishes that Catherine Blackwood had reason to fear this mirror before her death. It is a motive of sorts, though not one involving a human killer." He continued his methodical search of the desk, producing Catherine's diary. Flipping to the final entries, he read aloud. "January 12th. I saw someone else in the mirror today. Not my reflection, but someone behind me, watching. When I turned, no one was there." January 14th. It's getting worse. The figure in the mirror moves independently of me now. Last night I woke to find my reflection smiling at me while I lay terrified. January 16th. Professor Hartwell's letter confirms my fears. The mirror is a doorway. I've decided what must be done. January 17th. It knows what I plan. It won't let me destroy it. Tonight, I will try a different approach. If this fails, may God have mercy on my soul and Eliza's. Holmes closed the diary, his face grave. The final entry was written on the day of her death. I shivered despite myself. Holmes, these writings suggest delusion, perhaps even insanity. Perhaps, he agreed, or perhaps Catherine Blackwood encountered something beyond rational explanation. Either way, we now have context for her actions and her fear. He approached the mirror cautiously, studying it without touching it. Tomorrow, Watson, we must locate this Professor Hartwell, and I shall need to conduct some experiments on this mirror. As we prepared to leave, I noticed Holmes hesitate, his attention caught by something on the floor near the dressing table. He knelt, using his pocket magnifying glass to examine a spot near the base of the mirror. "Most interesting," he murmured. "Look here, Watson. What do you make of this?" I bent to see a small dark stain on the floorboards, partially hidden beneath the dressing table. Unlike the larger bloodstain from Catherine's body, this appeared older. "Another bloodstain," I suggested. "Yes," Holmes agreed, "but not from our victim. This stain predates her death by weeks, possibly months." He rose, a thoughtful expression on his face. "The mystery deepens, Watson, and I fear time may be of the essence if we are to prevent another tragedy in this house." As we left the room, locking the door behind us, neither of us noticed the faint ripple that passed across the surface of the mirror, like a stone disturbing still water. Nor did we see the shadowy figure that briefly appeared within its depths, watching our departure with hungry eyes. Chapter 4. The Professor's Warning. Morning arrived with a penetrating chill and a fog that seemed reluctant to release Thornfield Manor from its ghostly embrace. I found Holmes already dressed and pacing our shared sitting room when I emerged from my bedchamber, his expression indicating he had slept little, if at all. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me. "I trust you slept well despite our rather macabre surroundings." "Well enough," I admitted, though in truth my dreams had been plagued by distorted reflections and shadowy figures. "What's our plan for today?" "We must speak with Professor Hartwell without delay. I've sent a telegram to Oxford requesting a immediate meeting." Holmes paused by the window, gazing out at the mist-shrouded grounds. "In the meantime, I wish to examine the attic where the mirror was stored. Miss Blackwood has already given her permission, after a hasty breakfast, during which our hostess was notably absent. Suffering from a headache, Jenkins informed us. We were led to a narrow staircase that ascended to the manor's vast attic spaces. The air was thick with dust and the peculiar mustiness that accumulates in places long undisturbed. "Most of the items from India are stored in the east section," Jenkins explained, lighting additional lamps before handing one to Holmes. "The mirror was kept there until Miss Catherine had it brought down. Will you be requiring anything else, sir?" "No, thank you, Jenkins. We shall manage from here." Once alone among the shrouded furniture and stacked trunks, Holmes began a methodical examination of the area Jenkins had indicated. Sheets covered various pieces of furniture, while wooden crates stamped with shipping information from Calcutta and Bombay stood arranged against one wall. "Look for anything related to mirrors, Watson," Holmes instructed, already pulling aside coverings to reveal ornate cabinets, rolled carpets, and brass figurines of Hindu deities. I moved carefully through, the dusty maze, noting that despite decades of accumulation, there was a certain order to the storage. After several minutes, I called out, "Holmes, I believe I've found something." He joined me before a small trunk marked with the same celestial symbols we had observed on Catherine's mirror. The lock was broken, the lid slightly ajar. "Excellent," Holmes murmured, kneeling to examine it. He opened the trunk fully, revealing a collection of yellowed papers, small bottles containing dried substances, and a leather-bound journal. This appears to be documentation related to the mirror. He extracted the journal carefully, opening it to reveal handwritten entries dating back to 1835. The private journal of Colonel William Blackwood, it seems, the great-grandfather who acquired these items in India. Holmes began to read aloud. "Bittitieu, Dio, 12, 1835. Acquired a most unusual mirror today from a merchant in Varanasi who seemed almost desperate to be rid of it. The craftsmanship is exquisite. The silver frame adorned with what my guide describes as tantric symbols. The merchant warned it was not to be used during certain celestial alignments, particularly the dark of the moon. Superstitious nonsense, no doubt, but the piece itself is worth the 5 rupees I paid. June 3rd, 1835. Disturbing incident with the mirror today. My servant Anand refused to clean it, claiming he saw someone other than himself in the reflection. I dismissed his fears as native superstition, but upon examining the mirror myself, I must confess a momentary disorientation. For the briefest instant, my reflection seemed delayed. July 17th, 1835. Consulted with a Brahmin scholar about the mirror's symbols. He became visibly alarmed, calling it Shiva's Eye, or the Gate of Shiva. He claims such mirrors were created by tantric practitioners to commune with other planes of existence. When I dismissed his concerns, he warned that the barrier between worlds grows thin during the new moon, when Shiva's destructive aspect is strongest. Holmes flipped through several more pages, stopping at an entry marked with a dark stain. October 24, 1835. Tragedy has struck. My wife is dead by her own hand, or so it must appear. Found her before the mirror with her throat cut. Yet, when I first discovered her, I swear upon all that is holy that her reflection showed a different wound. Entirely. I cannot explain this, nor can I speak of it without risking my reputation for sanity. The mirror shall be crated and stored away. May God forgive me for bringing this curse into our home. I felt a chill run through me. Holmes, this is remarkably similar to Catherine Blackwood's death. Indeed, he replied grimly. It would seem history has repeated itself in this house. He continued searching through the trunk, producing a folded document written in Sanskrit with an English translation appended. A treatise on tantric practices involving mirrors as conduits between worlds. Holmes summarized after scanning it. It suggests that certain entities, neither gods nor demons, but something else entirely, can be contacted through properly consecrated mirrors. Once a connection is established, these entities may attempt to cross over during times when cosmic forces align, specifically during the new moon. Surely you don't believe such things? I asked, though with less conviction than I might have mustered before our arrival at Thornfield. Holmes carefully replaced the documents in the trunk. I believe in empirical evidence, Watson, and the evidence suggests that 2 women, separated by generations, died in identical fashion before the same mirror. Whether the explanation is supernatural or merely the deadly influence of family legend upon suggestible minds remains to be determined. Our exploration was interrupted by the arrival of a maid, who informed us that a response to Holmes's telegram had arrived. Professor Hartwell had agreed to meet us at his college in Oxford that afternoon. The journey to Oxford took just over an hour by train, during which Holmes sat in contemplative silence, occasionally making notes in his pocket journal. The university town greeted us with its familiar spires and ancient stone buildings, a welcome contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of Thornfield Manor. Professor Edward Hartwell received us in his cluttered office at Magdalen College, a tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. Books on archaeology, anthropology, and Eastern religions filled every available surface. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us, clearing stacks of papers from 2 chairs. I was deeply distressed to learn of Miss Catherine Blackwood's death, a bright young woman with a keen interest in Eastern artifacts. When we corresponded about her family's collection, I had no idea the mirror she described might pose actual danger. "You recognized it as something significant," Holmes observed. "Yes, from her description alone. The glass of Shiva is largely considered mythical, but accounts of such mirrors appear in obscure tantric texts. They were allegedly created to permit communication with what the texts call watchers between worlds." The professor removed his glasses, polishing them nervously. I assumed it was academic curiosity on her part. Had I known she was actively using the mirror? "You believe the mirror caused her death?" I asked skeptically. Hartwell hesitated. As a scholar, I should dismiss such notions. And yet, the historical accounts are remarkably consistent. These mirrors were said to open doorways during specific celestial alignments, allowing entities to cross over, first as reflections only, then gradually gaining influence in our world. "And their purpose in crossing over?" Holmes inquired. "To experience our reality through human vessels. The texts describe a process of replacement. The entity first observes, then mimics, then eventually supplants the human using the mirror." Hartwell's expression grew grave. "In essence, it steals their place in our world." "You warned Catherine about the new moon," Holmes noted. "Why is this significant?" "The new moon that occurred 3 nights ago, the night of her death, coincided with a rare alignment of planets visible from the northern hemisphere. According to the texts, such alignments create optimal conditions for passage between worlds." Hartwell leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Mr. Holmes, if you have this mirror in your possession, I strongly advise destroying it immediately. The writings suggest that once an entity has crossed over partially, enough to cause death, it will seek to complete its manifestation through another who shares blood with its first victim." "Miss Eliza Blackwood," I murmured. "Precisely," Holmes said, rising abruptly. "We must return to Thornfield at once. Thank you for your insights, Professor." As we hurried back to the station, Holmes's expression was troubled. "Watson, while I remain skeptical of supernatural explanations, we cannot ignore the pattern established here. Whether the threat is an otherworldly entity or a more mundane danger influenced by these beliefs, Miss Blackwood's life may indeed be at risk." The return journey seemed interminable, darkness falling as our train crawled through the countryside. By the time we reached the station nearest Thornfield, night had fully descended, and an unseasonable storm was brewing on the horizon. "No carriage," Holmes observed grimly as we surveyed the deserted platform. "We shall have to walk." As we set off along the country road, the first drops of rain began to fall, and lightning illuminated the distant silhouette of Thornfield Manor against the turbulent sky. I could not shake the feeling that whatever awaited us there, we were already too late. Chapter 5. Through the Looking Glass. The storm intensified as we made our way toward Thornfield Manor, transforming the country road into a treacherous ribbon of mud. Lightning tore across the sky in jagged patterns that reminded me eerily of the symbols adorning the accursed mirror's frame. Holmes strode ahead with single-minded determination, his collar turned up against the driving rain. "We must hurry, Watson," he called over the howling wind. "I fear Miss Blackwood may be in grave danger." From a mirror? I could not help but voice my lingering skepticism, even as apprehension gnawed at me. Holmes paused momentarily. From something or someone using the mirror as a conduit. Whether we attribute this to supernatural forces or to a clever human agent exploiting superstition matters little at present. The pattern established suggests imminent threat. After what seemed an eternity, the gates of Thornfield Manor appeared before us. As we passed through them, a resounding crack of thunder split the air, illuminating the house in stark relief against the storm-tossed sky. To my alarm, I noticed that despite the lateness of the hour, several windows blazed with light, including those of Catherine Blackwood's room. "Holmes!" I cried, pointing upward. "Look there!" His gaze followed my outstretched hand, and his expression hardened. Without another word, he broke into a run across the gravel drive, with me close behind. We reached the front entrance to find it unlocked, a detail that immediately put Holmes on alert. "Something is very wrong," he muttered, pushing the door open. The entrance hall was dimly lit and eerily silent. No servants appeared to take our wet coats. No sounds came from the depths of the house. Holmes moved swiftly toward the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. "Miss Blackwood," he called out. "Jenkins! Mrs. Winters!" Only silence answered. We ascended the stairs rapidly, making directly for the east wing where Catherine's room was located. As we approached the corridor, a low rhythmic chanting became audible, a woman's voice reciting words in a language I did not recognize. Holmes halted, raising a hand for caution. "Sanskrit," he whispered, "similar to the text we found in the attic." The chanting emanated from behind Catherine's door, which now stood partially open, golden lamplight spilling into the dark corridor. Holmes drew closer, peering through the gap. His sharp intake of breath prompted me to look as well. Within the room, an extraordinary scene unfolded. Miss Eliza Blackwood stood before the ornate mirror, dressed in her sister's nightgown, her hair loose about her shoulders in a style I had not seen her wear before. She swayed slightly as she chanted, arms outstretched toward the mirror's surface, which appeared to ripple and distort like water disturbed by an unseen hand. Most disturbing of all, her reflection in the mirror did not match her movements. While Eliza stood with arms extended, her reflection had one arm at its side, the other raised toward its throat in a gesture that chilled my blood. Holmes pushed the door open fully. "Miss Blackwood," he called sharply. "Step away from the mirror. Immediately!" She turned toward us, but her eyes held no recognition, only a vacant, glassy stare. "The passage must be completed," she intoned in a voice that seemed somehow layered, as though two people spoke simultaneously. "The vessel is prepared. The doorway stands open. She's in some form of trance." I whispered to Holmes, "We must remove her from this room." Before Holmes could respond, Eliza turned back to the mirror and resumed her chanting. To my horror, the surface of the glass began to bulge outward like a membrane, stretching toward her outstretched hands. Holmes acted with characteristic decisiveness, rushing forward and physically pulling Miss Blackwood away from the mirror. The moment contact between them was broken, she collapsed in his arms, unconscious but breathing. "Get her out of here. Watson!" Holmes commanded, thrusting the limp form of Miss Blackwood toward me. "Take her downstairs and locate the servants. I must examine that mirror before—" His words were cut short by a blinding flash, not lightning, but emanating from the mirror itself. I shielded my eyes with one hand while supporting Miss Blackwood with the other. When I could see again, I beheld a sight that defied rational explanation. The surface of the mirror had transformed into a swirling vortex of silver light, and from within that impossible depth, a figure was emerging, a woman's form that resembled Catherine Blackwood, yet was somehow wrong, like an artist's imperfect copy. Its movements were jerky and unnatural as it pushed against the boundary of the glass, which stretched like a membrane around its emerging head and shoulders. Holmes, momentarily frozen by this impossible sight, recovered quickly. He seized a heavy brass candlestick from the dressing table and, with a decisive swing, brought it crashing against the mirror's surface. The glass did not shatter as expected. Instead, it cracked in a spiderweb pattern, and a horrific shriek emerged. Not from Miss Blackwood, who remained unconscious in my arms, but from the mirror itself. The partially emerged figure writhed in apparent agony, caught between worlds in the fractured glass. "Again, Holmes!" I cried, backing toward the door with my insensible burden. Holmes raised the candlestick for another blow, but before it could fall, the entity within the mirror reached out with impossible speed, its arm extending through the cracked surface to seize Holmes's wrist. I watched in horror as my friend was jerked forward, nearly pulled into the mirror itself. With a strength born of desperation, Holmes braced his free hand against the dressing table and tore himself from the creature's grasp. In that moment of resistance, I glimpsed something that made my blood run cold. The entity's face shifted, revealing not Catherine's features, but something inhuman beneath, like a mask momentarily slipping. Holmes staggered backward, clutching his wrist where the thing had touched him. An angry red mark in the shape of a handprint was already forming on his skin. Without hesitation, he snatched a kerosene lamp from a nearby table and hurled it directly at the mirror. Glass shattered, oil sprayed, and flames erupted instantly. The shriek that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of Thornfield Manor, a sound of rage and thwarted hunger that could never have emerged from a human throat. The figure in the mirror twisted in the flames, its form collapsing on itself as the fire consumed the frame and the mysterious symbols carved upon it. "Run, Watson!" Holmes shouted, already moving toward me and the door. "The whole room may catch fire." We retreated to the corridor, Holmes slamming the door behind us. Through the solid oak, the unearthly wailing continued for several seconds, before abruptly falling silent. Only the crackling of flames remained. "We must alert the household," I said, still supporting the unconscious form of Miss Blackwood. Holmes nodded grimly. "Yes, though I suspect we may find them similarly affected. That entity, whatever it was, appears to have influenced everyone in the house to facilitate its emergence." As if in confirmation of his theory, we heard groaning from downstairs, followed by confused voices. Jenkins appeared at the end of the corridor, dishevelled and disoriented. "Mr. Holmes, what's happening?" "There's a fire." The butler seemed to have no recollection of how he came to be in his current state. "Ring the alarm bell, Jenkins," Holmes ordered, "and fetch water. We must contain this blaze before it spreads." As Jenkins hurried to comply, I looked down at Miss Blackwood, who had begun to stir in my arms. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear replacing the vacant stare of moments before. "What? Where am I? What's happening?" she murmured. "You're safe now," I assured her, though I felt far from certain about that claim. "There's been an incident with your sister's mirror." Holmes was watching the door to Catherine's room, where smoke had begun to seep through the cracks. "I believe we've destroyed it," he said quietly. "But at what cost, I wonder?" Behind us, the household was awakening from its collective trance, and the urgent business of fighting the fire would soon consume all attention. Yet as I caught Holmes's eye, I knew we both shared the same unspoken question. Had we truly vanquished whatever entity had reached through the mirror, or merely delayed its passage into our world? Chapter 6. Ashes and Revelations. Dawn broke over Thornfield Manor, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. The fire had been contained to Catherine's room, thanks to the swift action of the household staff and several farmhands from the estate, who had formed a bucket brigade. The east wing corridor bore scorch marks, and the acrid smell of smoke permeated the air, but the ancient house had survived largely intact. Miss Blackwood had been moved to a guest room in the west wing, where I attended to her throughout the remainder of the night. She suffered from shock and mild smoke inhalation, but displayed no lasting physical injuries. Her mental state, however, remained fragile. She had no memory of entering Catherine's room or standing before the mirror, recalling only fragmentary images like scenes from a fever dream. Holmes, meanwhile, had insisted on examining what remained of the mirror once the embers had cooled enough to permit entry to Catherine's room. I found him there as morning light filtered through the soot-stained windows, kneeling amidst the charred debris, his magnifying glass in hand. "Any insights, Holmes?" I asked, stepping carefully across the water-soaked floorboards. He looked up, his expression troubled. "To several, though none that will find their way into my monograph on criminal investigation. They would be dismissed as the ravings of a madman." He held up a fragment of twisted silver, a portion of the mirror's frame that had partially survived the flames. The symbols are still discernible. I've made sketches for further research. You cannot truly believe we encountered some supernatural entity. I kept my voice low, mindful of servants passing in the corridor. Holmes rose, pocketing the silver fragment. "I believe we witnessed phenomena that challenge conventional understanding, Watson. whether truly supernatural or merely unexplained by current scientific knowledge, is a philosophical distinction. He brushed ash from his hands. What cannot be disputed are the facts. 2 women, generations apart, died before this mirror with identical wounds. A third, Miss Eliza, was nearly added to that count. And the figure we saw emerging from the glass? A shadow crossed Holmes' face. A hallucination induced by suggestion and stress? Mass hysteria affecting both of us simultaneously? Or something else entirely? He shook his head. I confess, Watson, for perhaps the first time in my career, I find myself at the boundary of rational explanation. We were interrupted by Jenkins, who appeared at the doorway with an expression of grave concern. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Inspector, Graves has arrived from Guildford. He's heard about the fire and is demanding to speak with you both. Holmes nodded. Of course, we shall join him directly. We found Inspector Graves in the drawing room, a rotund man with impressive side whiskers and the pompous demeanour of a provincial official who feels his authority has been undermined. He was interrogating a visibly exhausted Miss Blackwood when we entered. Ah, Mr. Holmes, he greeted with barely concealed hostility. I understand you've managed to destroy key evidence in an ongoing investigation, and nearly burn down a historic house in the process. Inspector Graves, Holmes replied evenly. I believe I've helped prevent a 3rd death in this house. Evidence was not destroyed, but rather a threat neutralized. The inspector scoffed. A threat? The only ongoing threat was Miss Catherine Blackwood's mental instability, a condition her sister apparently shares. He gestured toward Miss Blackwood, who flinched at his words. First, one sister commits suicide and claims it was a magical mirror. Now the other sets fire to the house, claiming possession. The medical authorities at Bedlam might be more appropriate than a detective, Mr. Holmes. I felt my temper rising at his callous assessment, but Holmes placed a restraining hand on my arm. Perhaps, Holmes suggested mildly, we might discuss the case privately, Inspector. I have information that may shed light on both deaths, Catherine's and that of her great-grandmother nearly 60 years ago. This caught Graves's attention. What do you mean, both deaths? If you'll excuse us, Miss Blackwood, Holmes said with a gentle nod to our hostess. I believe you could use some rest after your ordeal. Once she had withdrawn, Holmes retrieved his notebook and laid out the facts of the case systematically. The discovery of Colonel Blackwood's journal, Professor Hartwell's expertise on the mirror, and the striking similarities between the 2 deaths. He presented the evidence as a series of historical facts, carefully avoiding any mention of what we had witnessed the night before. So you see, Inspector, Holmes concluded, Catherine Blackwood's death followed a pattern established decades earlier. Whether influenced by family history or some other factor, the psychological impact of that mirror on both women is undeniable. Graves's expression had shifted from dismissive to thoughtful. You suggest that Catherine, having learned of her great-grandmother's suicide before the same mirror, became obsessed and ultimately reenacted the death? It is one possible explanation, Holmes conceded. The power of suggestion can be formidable, particularly when reinforced by family legend. The inspector stroked his whiskers. And last night, Miss Eliza was found in her sister's room in a state of, how did you describe it? Somnambulism, I offered. Sleepwalking, possibly triggered by grief and the same family stories that affected her sister. And you destroyed the mirror to prevent her from harming herself. Graves nodded slowly. Unorthodox, but perhaps understandable under the circumstances. I marvelled at Holmes's ability to present the facts in a way that allowed the inspector to reach a conclusion that, while not entirely accurate, was at least plausible within his worldview. Graves departed shortly thereafter, declaring Catherine's death a suicide influenced by hereditary melancholia, and the fire an unfortunate accident during a sleepwalking episode. You didn't tell him everything, I observed once we were alone. Would you have done in my position? Holmes asked. Some truths, Watson, serve no purpose beyond destroying a man's fundamental understanding of his world. Graves has a framework that allows him to make sense of these events. Let him keep it. Later that afternoon, Miss Blackwood requested our presence in the library. We found her more composed, though still pale and drawn. "I owe you both my life," she said without preamble. "And Jenkins has told me how you pulled me from Catherine's room before the fire consumed it. But there's more, isn't there? Something about the mirror that you're not telling me." Holmes studied her for a moment before responding. "You recall nothing of last night. Fragments only. I remember looking into a hand mirror while preparing for bed and feeling called, compelled to go to Catherine's room." She shuddered. After that, only disjointed images standing before her mirror, seeing something reaching for me from within it, and feeling as though I was being pushed aside in my own body. Holmes exchanged a glance with me before continuing. "Miss Blackwood, we have reason to believe that the mirror your sister brought down from the attic was more than an ordinary object, whether through some property of its construction or through the power of suggestion. It exerted an influence that led to your sister's death and nearly claimed you as well. The same mirror that killed my great-grandmother," she whispered. "The family stories were true. Perhaps," Holmes said carefully. "What matters now is that the mirror is destroyed. The threat it posed, whatever its nature, has ended." She nodded slowly. "You know, before you arrived I had been seeing things in reflections throughout the house. Glimpses of Catherine, or someone who looked like her. I thought grief was driving me mad." She paused, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. "Last night, after you rescued me, I dreamed Catherine came to me. She looked peaceful. She said she was free now, and so was I." I expected Holmes to dismiss this as the product of a traumatized mind, but he merely nodded. The subconscious often processes trauma through such imagery. Whatever the reality, I believe you may indeed be free of this particular shadow, Miss Blackwood. As we prepared to depart Thornfield Manor the following morning, Miss Blackwood presented Holmes with a small package. "A token of my gratitude," she explained. "It belonged to my father, a detective of sorts himself, in his amateur enthusiasm for unsolved historical mysteries." Holmes unwrapped the package to reveal a handsome magnifying glass with an ivory handle. "Most thoughtful," he said with genuine appreciation. "Though I hope you won't think me ungrateful if I suggest that perhaps Thornfield Manor might benefit from fewer heirlooms and more new beginnings." She smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from her. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, I've decided to travel for a time. Perhaps Italy, where the sun is bright and mirrors are simply mirrors." As our train pulled away from the station, Holmes remained unusually quiet, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside. "You're troubled still," I observed. "A case with an ending that satisfies neither logic nor law, Watson. A rare occurrence in my practice. Yet 2 lives were saved, Miss Blackwood's, and potentially whoever might have been next in the cycle." Holmes nodded slowly. "There is that consolation." He withdrew the fragment of silver frame from his pocket, studying it one last time before tucking it away. "Some mysteries, it seems, are meant to remain just that, mysteries." I could not help but notice, however, that for several weeks following our return to Baker Street, Holmes avoided looking directly into mirrors. And on more than one occasion, I found him standing before our sitting-room mirror late at night, watching his reflection with an intensity that suggested he was looking not at himself, but for something else that might be looking back. Chapter 7. The Science of the Impossible. 3 weeks after our return from Thornfield Manor, Baker Street had resumed its familiar rhythms. Holmes had immersed himself in a series of minor cases, mostly routine matters of missing documents and suspected infidelities, which he solved with his customary efficiency, but little of the intellectual satisfaction that more challenging problems typically afforded him. Yet I observed that during the quiet hours, particularly in the evenings after our clients had departed, he would often withdraw to his chemical apparatus, or lose himself in obscure texts that had never before featured in his library. Volumes on Eastern mysticism, folklore regarding mirrors, and even a treatise on dimensional theory by an eccentric German physicist. On the mantelpiece sat the silver fragment from the mirror's frame, now mounted in a small glass case like a specimen. Occasionally, I would catch Holmes studying it intently, turning it in the lamplight to examine the symbols etched into its surface. "You're still troubled by the Thornfield affair," I remarked one evening, as rain battered the windows of our sitting room. Holmes glanced up from the ancient Sanskrit text he had been attempting to decipher. "Not troubled, Watson. Intrigued. The case presents a fascinating intellectual problem. The problem of whether we witnessed something supernatural? The problem," he corrected, "of where to draw the line between the impossible and the merely improbable. Consider, throughout history, phenomena once attributed to supernatural forces have later been explained through scientific advancement. Electricity was once considered magical. Illness was attributed to demons before Pasteur. You believe there might be a scientific explanation for what we saw in that mirror?" Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Science constantly expands the boundaries of the known world. Perhaps what we witnessed was not supernatural at all, but rather a manifestation of natural laws we do not yet comprehend." He rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, removing the silver fragment from its case. "These symbols, for instance. Professor Hartwell suggested they were meant to facilitate communication across different planes of existence. What if, instead, they somehow manipulate aspects of reality we cannot yet measure? Energy fields, perhaps, or dimensions beyond our perception?" I shook my head, remembering all too vividly the inhuman figure emerging from the mirror's surface. "That seems a rather convenient reframing of the supernatural into scientific terminology, Holmes." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Perhaps, Watson. Yet the distinction matters greatly to me." Our conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a telegram for Holmes. He opened it with a small frown, which, deepened as he read its contents. "From Miss Blackwood," he said, passing it to me. "It seems our case may not be as concluded as we thought. The telegram was brief but disturbing. Have seen Catherine in glass again. Stop thought impossible after mirror destroyed. Stop happening in all reflective surfaces. Stop. Please advise. Stop Eliza Blackwood. Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "You don't think—" "I think we must not jump to conclusions," Holmes cautioned, though his expression betrayed his concern. "The human mind, under stress, is remarkably susceptible to suggestion. Having once believed she saw her sister in reflections, Miss Blackwood may now be experiencing the psychological after-effects of trauma." "Or," I suggested reluctantly, "whatever was in that mirror wasn't destroyed by the fire." Holmes was silent for a moment. "There is another possibility. If that entity, whatever it was, originated not in the mirror itself, but merely used it as a gateway, then destroying the mirror may have been insufficient. It may have already established enough of a presence in our world to persist without its original conduit." The implications chilled me. What should we do? Holmes folded the telegram carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "First, I shall wire Professor Hartwell for any additional insights he might have on the persistent effects of such phenomena. Then I believe we must prepare for a return journey to Thornfield Manor." "You think Miss Blackwood is in danger?" "I think," Holmes said gravely, "that we left a mystery half solved. And in my experience, Watson, such loose ends have a way of entangling themselves around the throats of the unwary." The following morning brought another telegram, not from Miss Blackwood, but from Jenkins, the butler. "Miss Blackwood, taken ill, stop. Doctor baffled. Stop, she asks for you. Stop, please come with urgency." Stop Holmes was already reaching for his coat before I finished reading aloud. "Pack quickly, Watson. The 10:15 train will get us to Surrey by early afternoon." As we rushed to catch our train, I could not help but recall the eerie figure we had glimpsed emerging from the mirror, half human, half something else. Despite the bright spring day around us, I felt a shadow of dread descending. "Holmes," I said as our hansom rattled toward the station, "what exactly are we facing? If the entity wasn't destroyed, then we are dealing with something that exists between classification systems, Watson, neither fully material nor purely conceptual. Something that can inhabit reflections like a parasite, moving between them at will." His expression was uncharacteristically grim. "And something that has already claimed 2 lives in its hunger to fully enter our world. How does one fight such a thing?" I asked. Holmes's hand moved unconsciously to his inner pocket, where I knew he carried the silver fragment from the mirror's frame. "That, my dear Watson, is what we must discover, preferably before it claims Miss Blackwood as its third victim." Chapter 8. Reflections of Fear. The transformation of Thornfield Manor. In the short weeks since our departure was startling. As our carriage approached up the long drive, I noticed that every window had been covered with heavy cloth, blocking all natural light from entering. The gardens, already neglected during our previous visit, now appeared completely abandoned, with weeds overtaking the gravel paths. Jenkins met us at the door, his usual composure shattered. Deep shadows beneath his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and his hands trembled visibly as he took our coats. "Thank heaven you've come, Mr. Holmes," he said in a low voice. "Things have grown dire since Miss Blackwood sent that telegram. She's confined to her bed now, refusing food, speaking in voices not her own." "Voices?" Holmes asked sharply. "Explain." "Sometimes she sounds like herself, sir, begging for help. Other times—" Jenkins lowered his voice further. "Other times she speaks in Miss Catherine's voice, or in languages none of us recognize, and she insists that all mirrors and reflective surfaces be removed or covered. Even water in a glass disturbs her greatly." Holmes's expression darkened. "Take us to her immediately." We followed Jenkins up the main staircase and down a corridor I had not visited during our previous stay. The west wing of Thornfield presented a stark contrast to the east, less ornate, more practical in its furnishings, yet equally shrouded in gloom with its covered windows and minimal lamplight. "She insisted on moving to these rooms after your departure," Jenkins explained as we approached a heavy oak door. "Said the east wing held too many memories." A grim-faced nurse stepped out as we arrived. "She's been restless all morning." "They do," woman reported, "talking to herself or to someone we cannot see. The doctor administered a sedative an hour ago, which has calmed her somewhat." Holmes nodded briskly. "We shall not disturb her rest. Instead, I would like to examine her new quarters while she sleeps." The nurse looked uncertain, but stepped aside at Jenkins' nod. Holmes entered the dimly lit bedchamber with characteristic, careful observation, his keen eyes taking in every detail. Miss Blackwood lay motionless upon the bed, her face ashen against the dark pillows, her breathing shallow but regular. What struck me immediately was the complete absence of any reflective surface in the room. No mirrors adorned the walls. The windows were covered with blankets. Even the water pitcher by the bedside had been replaced with an opaque ceramic mug. Holmes circled the room slowly, examining the covered windows, the hearth, and finally the bedside table, where several medicine bottles stood in neat formation. He lifted each in turn, reading the labels with a slight frown. "Laudanum," he murmured, "prescribed in rather high doses. And this—" he held up another bottle. "Chloral. Hydrate. Potent sedatives both, Watson. Standard treatments for nervous disorders, I observed." "Perhaps," Holmes conceded, "though I question whether sedation is an appropriate response to what afflicts Miss Blackwood." His attention was suddenly drawn to a small wastepaper basket beside the bed. Kneeling, he extracted several crumpled sheets of paper, carefully smoothing them out. "Most interesting," he murmured. "Look, Watson." The papers contained drawings, dozens of them, rendered in increasingly unsteady hands. Each depicted the same subject, a female figure emerging from what appeared to be a mirror or pool of water. In the earliest drawings, the figure resembled Catherine Blackwood, as I remembered her from the portrait in the drawing room. But in each subsequent sketch, the figure became progressively distorted, the eyes too large, the limbs elongated beyond human proportion, the mouth stretched in an impossible smile. The final drawing showed not one figure but two, one still partially trapped within the reflective surface, reaching for another that stood before it. The second figure was clearly meant to be Eliza, Blackwood herself. "She's documented the entity's progression," Holmes said softly, "its gradual transformation as it attempts to fully manifest." A faint sound from the bed drew our attention. Miss Blackwood's eyes had opened, though they appeared unfocused, gazing at some middle distance. "Miss Blackwood?" I approached cautiously. "It's Dr. Watson. Mr. Holmes and I have come as you requested." Her head turned slowly toward the sound of my voice, but her eyes remained strangely vacant. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It didn't die. You didn't kill it." Her fingers clutched spasmodically at the bed covers. "It was waiting, watching from every reflection, getting stronger." Holmes stepped closer. "What does it want, Miss Blackwood?" A bitter smile twisted her lips, an expression so uncharacteristic that it seemed to belong to another face entirely. "What all trapped things want, Mr. Holmes. Freedom, form, life." Her voice changed subtly, taking on a sing-song quality. "A body to wear like a glove, eyes to see with, hands to touch with." I felt a chill at her words. Holmes, however, maintained his composed demeanour. "You're fighting it," he observed. "That's why you've removed all reflective surfaces, to limit its access to you." She nodded weakly. "It comes through the reflections. Gets stronger each time I look, each time I see." Her voice broke. "I see Catherine, but it's not her anymore. It's wearing her like a mask that's slipping." Her gaze suddenly sharpened, focusing directly on Holmes with surprising intensity. "You brought a piece of it back with you, didn't you?" Holmes stiffened almost imperceptibly. "A fragment of the mirror frame, yes." "I can feel it," she whispered. "Even now, it calls to me." Her eyes drifted closed again, the brief moment of lucidity passing. "So tired of fighting, it never stops watching." As her breathing settled back into the rhythm of drugged sleep, Holmes beckoned me into the corridor. "Her condition is worse than I anticipated," he said in a low voice. "The entity, whatever it may be, has established a connection that persists despite the destruction of the original mirror." "Could it be a form of madness?" I suggested. "Trauma-induced delusions exacerbated by grief and suggestion." "That would be the comfortable explanation," Holmes conceded. "Yet it fails to account for what we ourselves witnessed in Catherine's room. No, Watson, I fear we are dealing with something quite real, if utterly outside our normal experience." Jenkins approached, his expression grave. "Mr. Holmes, there's something else you should know. The local villagers are talking. 3 people have reported seeing Miss Catherine walking the grounds at night, though her body lies buried in the family plot." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Superstitious fancy, perhaps?" "Perhaps, sir. But Mrs. Winters saw her too, or something wearing her likeness. Said she was standing by the old well in the east garden, just staring at the water's surface." Jenkins lowered his voice. "The next morning we found wet footprints leading from the well to Miss Eliza's room." "And when was this?" Holmes asked sharply. "The night before she took ill, sir." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me. "Watson, I believe it's time we examined the grounds, particularly this well. Jenkins, ensure that someone remains with Miss Blackwood at all times. Under no circumstances is she to be left alone, even for a moment." As we descended the main staircase, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You have a theory?" I prompted. "Several, each more improbable than the last." He paused at the bottom of the stairs. But one possibility stands out. What if the mirror was never the true conduit at all? What if it was merely one of many possible doorways? Doorways to what? Holmes's eyes met mine, troubled in a way I had rarely seen. To whatever lies on the other side of reflection, Watson. To the place where our world is echoed. As we stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, the wind carried the distant sound of water splashing against stone, a rhythmic pulse from the direction of the old well, like something stirring in its depths. Chapter 9. The Well of Shadows. The old well stood in what had once been the kitchen garden, now a tangle of overgrown herbs and climbing roses gone wild. A simple stone structure with a weathered wooden roof, it appeared utterly ordinary in the fading light of late afternoon. Yet as we approached, I experienced an inexplicable sense of dread that seemed to emanate from its dark mouth like a physical presence. Holmes circled the well carefully, examining the ground around it. Footprints, he observed, indicating several partial impressions in the damp earth. Small, feminine. They approach the well from the house and then return along the same path. He knelt to examine the stone rim, running his fingers along the moss-covered surface. There's water on these stones, Watson. Not from rain. It hasn't rained in days, but as if someone wet emerged from within. I peered down into the well's depths. The water below reflected the darkening sky above, a perfect circle of twilight trapped within stone walls. Something about that reflection seemed wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what troubled me. "Holmes," I said quietly, "look at the water." He joined me, gazing down into the dark surface. After a moment, he stiffened. "It's not moving." He was right. Despite the breeze that stirred the overgrown garden around us, the water's surface remained perfectly still. Unnaturally, so like glass rather than liquid. Holmes picked up a small pebble and dropped it into the well. Instead of creating ripples, the stone seemed to pass through the surface as if it were an illusion, disappearing without disturbing the mirror-like water. "Most extraordinary," Holmes murmured. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver fragment from Catherine's mirror, holding it over the well. The effect was immediate and disturbing. The water below began to ripple without any physical cause, the movements forming concentric circles that expanded outward from directly beneath. "The fragment. A connection," Holmes said. "The same symbols that adorn the mirror frame are carved into the inner wall of this well, though worn by time and water. Look there." He pointed to barely visible markings on the stone just above the waterline. "You believe this well served the same purpose as the mirror?" I asked. "I believe both were created as conduits to the same place, or perhaps to the same entity." Holmes pocketed the fragment. "Consider the possibilities, Watson. What if this entity resides not in mirrors themselves, but in a parallel realm that can only be accessed through reflections?" A soft splashing sound from below made us both freeze. The water had begun to move on its own, the surface undulating as if something were rising from the depths. Yet the well was known to be shallow, barely 10 feet to the bottom, according to Jenkins. "Step back, Watson," Holmes commanded, his voice tense. We retreated several paces as the splashing grew louder. Then, rising from the water's surface, like a periscope, emerged what appeared to be a human head. Wet, dark hair plastered to a pale face that was unmistakably feminine, yet somehow wrong, as though the features had been imperfectly moulded by an unskilled artist. Catherine Blackwood, I breathed, or something wearing her form. The figure rose further, shoulders and arms becoming visible as it braced itself against the stone sides of the well. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet manipulated by an inexperienced handler. Water ran down its form, which appeared solid yet somehow insubstantial, as though not fully materialized in our world. Then it turned its face upward, and I had to stifle a cry of alarm. What I had taken for Catherine's features were in fact a crude approximation. The eyes too wide and unblinking, the mouth a slash that opened too far when it spoke. "The fragment," it said in a voice that echoed oddly, as if speaking through water. "Return what was taken." Holmes, to his credit, maintained his composure in the face of this impossible apparition. "What are you?" he demanded. "What do you want with the Blackwood women?" The thing smiled, a hideous stretching of its incomplete features. "Passage," it said. "The door was opened long ago, when the first Blackwood cursed these waters with blood and silver." Its gaze, cold and alien, fixed on Holmes. "The sisters are the key, one to open the way, one to complete the crossing." "And if we prevent this crossing?" The creature's laugh was like stones scraping together under water. "Then I remain between neither here nor there, hungry without satisfaction, aware without wholeness. Would you condemn me to such an existence, detective?" "If it saves innocent lives, yes," Holmes replied without hesitation. The thing's expression contorted with rage. "Then the sister will suffer as I suffer, caught between worlds, never fully in either. Already she feels the pull. Already she hears my voice when she sleeps." Its inhuman eyes narrowed. "And you, detective, you carry my essence with you. The good fragment calls to its whole. It will bring you back to me." With those chilling words, the entity began to sink back into the well, its movements becoming more fluid as it submerged. Just before its face disappeared beneath the surface, it spoke once more. "Tonight is the 7th day since the burning. The cycle completes. She will come to me willingly, or I will tear through every reflective surface in that house to claim her." The water settled into unnatural stillness once more, the perfect reflected sky showing no evidence of the horror we had just witnessed. Holmes turned to me, his face pale but determined. "We must return to the house immediately, Watson. Whatever this entity plans, it will happen tonight, and Miss Blackwood is in grave danger." Chapter 10. The 7th Night. We hurried back to Thornfield Manor as the last light faded from the sky, the knowledge of what we had witnessed lending urgency to our steps. Holmes's face bore an expression I had rarely seen, a combination of intellectual fascination and genuine concern that betrayed the gravity of our situation. 7 days since the burning, Holmes muttered as we approached the house. "A cycle completing. The number 7 appears frequently in mystical traditions, Watson. Dolchoho, 7 gates of the underworld in Babylonian myth. The 7 chakras in Hindu tradition. 7 days of creation." "You cannot possibly believe in such superstitions," I protested. though with less conviction than I might have mustered before seeing that thing rise from the well. "I believe in observation and evidence," Holmes replied, "and the evidence suggests that whatever force we're confronting operates according to patterns. Patterns that align with what humans have historically interpreted as mystical or supernatural." Jenkins met us at the door, his expression grim. "Miss Blackwood has taken a turn for the worse, sir. She's awake but delirious, insisting that her sister is calling to her from every reflective surface in the house." "Has she attempted to leave her room?" Holmes asked sharply. "The nurse has been restraining her on the doctor's orders. He fears she might harm herself." Holmes's expression darkened. "Take us to her immediately. And Jenkins, gather all the salt in the house." The butler blinked in surprise. "Salt, sir?" "Yes, a substantial quantity. Another protective measure, bring lamps as well, as many as can be spared, and any silver objects the house contains." As Jenkins hurried to comply, Holmes turned to me. "If this entity operates according to rules that have informed human folklore across cultures, then traditional protections may prove effective. Salt has been used as a barrier against supernatural forces in dozens of traditions. Silver is considered pure and anathema to entities of darkness. Light, of course, is the natural enemy of shadow." I might have scoffed at such methods days earlier, but after our encounter at the well, I found myself grateful for any potential defense, however esoteric. We found Miss Blackwood's room in chaos. The nurse, a stout woman with a usually unflappable demeanour, was visibly shaken. Miss Blackwood herself sat rigidly upright in bed, her eyes following something invisible around the room, her lips moving in silent conversation. "She's been like this for an hour," the nurse whispered, "talking to thin air, claiming she can see her sister in the shadows." Holmes approached the bed cautiously. "Miss Blackwood, it's Sherlock Holmes. Dr. Watson and I have returned to help you." Her gaze snapped to him with unnerving suddenness. "You saw it," she said, her voice hoarse. "At the well. It told you about me." A trembling hand reached toward him. "You carry a piece of it. I can feel it calling." Holmes nodded gravely. "Yes, we encountered the entity. It threatened to claim you tonight." Rather than appearing frightened, Miss Blackwood smiled, a vacant, eerie expression. "The seventh night. The doorway opens widest at midnight." Her voice took on the disconcertingly layered quality we had heard before. "She waits for me at the threshold, my sister, my reflection, my other self." "That is not your sister," Holmes said firmly. "Whatever you see, whatever speaks to you wearing Catherine's face, is something else entirely. Something that has been trying to enter our world for generations." Miss Blackwood's expression flickered between confusion and that same vacant smile. "It needs me," she whispered, "as it needed Catherine. A vessel of the same blood to complete the crossing." Jenkins entered with 2 footmen, all carrying the items Holmes had requested. Under Holmes's direction, they began laying a thick line of salt across every threshold and windowsill in the room. Silver candlesticks, trays, and utensils were positioned throughout the space, and additional lamps were lit until the room blazed, with light banishing all but the most stubborn shadows. "These precautions may seem peculiar," Holmes explained to the bewildered nurse, "but they represent barriers that the entity we're dealing with may find difficult to cross." You truly believe we face something supernatural? I asked quietly. As we worked, Holmes arranged a series of silver objects in a semicircle around Miss Blackwood's bed. I believe we face something that exists according to rules outside our current scientific understanding. Whether we label that supernatural is largely semantic, Watson. As the preparations continued, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. The air seemed to thicken, becoming difficult to breathe. The flames in the lamps flickered despite the absence of any draught. Most disturbing of all, Miss Blackwood's agitation grew, her eyes darting to corners of the room where shadows persisted despite the abundant light. "It's coming," she whispered. "It's finding the cracks between worlds, the places where reflection meets reality." Holmes checked his pocket watch. 11:40, 20 minutes until midnight. He turned to Jenkins. "Is there a clock in this house that strikes the hour?" "The grandfather clock in the hall, sir. Disable it. I suspect the entity may time its full manifestation to coincide precisely with midnight. Let's not provide it with an announcement." As Jenkins departed on this errand, Holmes withdrew the silver fragment from his pocket, studying it thoughtfully. "This appears to maintain a connection to the entity. Perhaps it can be used as a lure or a trap." "How do you propose to trap something that exists between dimensions?" I asked. "By using its own doorway against it," Holmes replied, a plan clearly forming in his mind. "It seeks passage into our world, but passages operate in both directions." Miss Blackwood suddenly seized Holmes's wrist, her strength surprising for someone in her weakened state. "It's beginning," she gasped. "Can't you see them? The reflections are moving independently." I followed her gaze to a silver tray, positioned near the window. To my horror, I saw not our reflections cast upon its surface, but what appeared to be rippling water. The same unnatural stillness we had observed in the well, now beginning to stir. Holmes's expression remained focused, his mind calculating even as impossible events unfolded around us. "Watson, we must act quickly. The entity comes, and I believe I know how to send it back." Chapter 11. The Final Reflection. "Watson, take Miss Blackwood to the far corner of the room," Holmes instructed, his voice unnaturally calm amidst the growing chaos. "Keep her surrounded by the silver objects and within the salt boundary." I did as he directed, helping the weakened woman from her bed. She moved as if in a trance, her eyes never leaving the silver tray where impossible ripples continued to form. "It's coming through," she whispered. "All the reflections, they're becoming doorways." She was right. To my horror, every reflective surface in the room, the silver candlesticks, the water pitcher, even the glass of the window panes, now showed not our reflections, but glimpses of what appeared to be another place entirely. A dark, inverted version of the very room we stood in, as though viewed through murky water. Holmes worked with feverish intensity, positioning the fragment from the mirror frame in the center of the room, directly beneath the largest oil lamp. He arranged a perfect circle of salt. "The entity is drawn to this fragment," he explained rapidly. "It wants to be whole again. If my theory is correct, it must fully manifest in our world to reclaim this piece of itself. When it does, we will have a brief opportunity to act." "Act how?" I demanded, supporting Miss Blackwood as she swayed unsteadily beside me. "To reverse the process," Holmes replied. to push it back through its own doorway and seal the passage behind it. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, our breath visible in the chill air. The flames in the lamps guttered, though they did not extinguish completely. Outside, wind rose in an unnatural gale, rattling the windows with violent force. "Holmes!" I called out in alarm as the silver tray nearest to us began to bulge outward, its polished surface stretching like a membrane about to burst. "Hold your position," he commanded, extracting a small vial from his waistcoat pocket, one I recognized from his chemical collection at Baker Street. "The entity must fully commit to manifestation before we can counter it." Miss Blackwood went rigid in my grasp, her back arching unnaturally. "She's here," she gasped, in a voice that seemed to emerge from the depths of her being. "My sister. No, not my sister. The thing that took her." From every reflective surface in the room, a silvery liquid began to seep. Not water, but something that moved with deliberate purpose, flowing across floors and furniture toward the center of the room, where Holmes stood beside his circle of salt and the mirror fragment. The streams converged on the circle's edge, pooling and rising into a column that gradually assumed a human shape. The same distorted approximation of Catherine Blackwood we had seen at the well, but more substantial now, more defined. Its movements were smoother, its features more precise, though still unnervingly wrong in subtle ways that defied exact description. "Sherlock Holmes," it spoke, its voice resonating with unnatural harmonics. "You believe you can stop what was set in motion generations ago?" It smiled, a too wide stretching of its lips. The first Blackwood opened the way with blood and silver. His blood flows in her veins. It gestured toward Eliza. "The cycle completes tonight." Holmes stood his ground, remarkably composed in the face of this impossible confrontation. "You need the fragment to complete your manifestation," he stated, "and you need Miss Blackwood as your vessel to remain in this world." The entity's smile widened further. "Clever detective. Indeed, I require both. The fragment to be whole, the vessel to be anchored." It extended a hand toward the silver piece. "Return what is mine, and I shall grant you a merciful departure from this place. And if I refuse," the thing's expression contorted with sudden rage, "then I shall take it, along with your life and the lives of everyone in this house." With frightening speed, it lunged toward Holmes, only to recoil as it encountered the salt circle, its form rippling with distortion where it touched the boundary. "As I suspected," Holmes said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "You cannot cross certain barriers while still between states." He lifted the fragment, holding it just above the salt line. "You want this? Then fully commit to our world, every particle of your being," the entity growled, an inhuman sound that vibrated the very air. "You think to trap me? I have existed between worlds for centuries, detective. I have waited through generations of Blackwoods for this moment. Now, Watson!" Holmes shouted suddenly. "The silver!" Understanding his plan in a flash of intuition, I grabbed a silver candlestick and thrust it towards the entity. The creature hissed and recoiled, its form becoming momentarily less substantial where the silver approached. Emboldened, I continued, advancing with the silver object extended. "Holmes, it works! The silver repels it!" "Not merely repels," Holmes called back, reaching for the vial in his pocket. The silver disrupts its cohesion in our reality. Force it back toward the largest. Reflection. Working in tandem, we herded the entity toward the window, where the glass now showed only the dark, inverted otherworld from which it had emerged. The creature fought back, its form stretching and lashing out like living mercury. But wherever the silver touched, it recoiled. Miss Blackwood, who had been silent during this confrontation, suddenly straightened. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The connection. It's pulling at me still." Holmes uncorked the vial. "Iron sulfate," he explained rapidly. "If silver disrupts its form, perhaps iron, long associated with protection against the supernatural, will sever its connection completely." He flung the contents of the vial in an arc that spattered both the entity and the window behind it. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The creature shrieked, its form smoking and dissolving where the iron compound touched it. The windows, glass, similarly affected, began to ripple and distort more violently. "The doorway destabilizes," Holmes shouted over the entity's unearthly wailing. "Watson, the fragment!" I caught the silver piece as Holmes tossed it to me, understanding instantly what he intended. With all my strength, I hurled the fragment at the entity. It struck the creature's chest and sank into its liquid form like a stone in water. The effect was catastrophic for the entity. Its body convulsed, the fragment glowing within it like a burning coal. The window behind it shattered, not into pieces, but into a swirling vortex that pulled at the creature with irresistible force. "It's being drawn back," Holmes called, bracing himself against the supernatural wind that now howled through the room. Trinchum, entity fought with desperate strength, one liquescent arm stretching toward Miss Blackwood. "The vessel!" it shrieked. "Mine!" But the pull was too strong. With a final, inhuman wail, the creature was sucked through the vortex, the shattered window reforming behind it into ordinary glass. For a brief moment, we could see it on the other side. A distorted, raging figure trapped in a world of reflections. Then, with a final flash of silver light, both the entity and its otherworldly realm vanished, leaving only our own reflections staring back at us from the window pane. The sudden silence was deafening. Holmes and I exchanged a look of shared disbelief at what we had just witnessed, and what we had somehow survived. Miss Blackwood collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "It's gone," she whispered. "I can't feel it anymore. The voices, they've stopped." Chapter 12. Reflections on Truth. A week after the extraordinary events at Thornfield Manor, Holmes and I sat before the fire in our Baker Street lodgings, each lost in contemplation. Outside, London carried on in blissful ignorance of the otherworldly horror we had confronted. Hansoms rattled over cobblestones, street vendors called their wares, and the great machinery of the city continued its relentless rhythm. Holmes had been uncharacteristically quiet since our return, spending long hours with his chemical experiments or playing melancholy airs on his violin. Tonight, however, he seemed ready to speak of what we had experienced. "You've been writing up the case, Watson?" he asked, nodding toward the papers spread before me. I set down my pen with a sigh. "I've attempted to, but I find myself at a loss. How does one document events that defy rational explanation? No editor would publish such an account. It would be dismissed as sensationalist fiction." Perhaps that is for the best, Holmes replied, tamping tobacco into his pipe. There are some truths for which the world is not yet prepared. And yet they remain truths, I insisted. What we witnessed at Thornfield was undeniable, Holmes finished for me, yet simultaneously inexplicable within our current scientific framework. He lit his pipe, the flare of the match momentarily illuminating his sharp features. I find myself in the uncomfortable position of having observed phenomena I cannot fully explain through known natural laws. You still seek a rational explanation? Holmes exhaled a cloud of smoke. I seek understanding, Watson. If our understanding of natural laws must expand to accommodate new observations, then so be it. That is the essence of scientific progress. The memory of that liquid form emerging from every reflective surface still haunted my dreams. And what of Miss Blackwood? Have you had any word? A telegram arrived this morning, Holmes said, reaching for a slip of paper on the side table. She reports a full recovery and plans to sell Thornfield Manor. She'll be travelling abroad, beginning, rather pointedly, with countries known for their abundant sunshine. I couldn't help but smile at this. A sensible precaution, though we believe the entity to be banished. Banished, yes, Holmes agreed. But I wonder if truly destroyed. The fragment we used to force it back through the doorway was reabsorbed into its form. If that fragment maintained a connection to our world for generations. He left the implication hanging in the air between us. Surely you don't think it could return? Holmes contemplated the ember of his pipe. I think that in the vast architecture of reality, Watson, there exist spaces between what we perceive and what we don't. Liminal regions where entities such as our reflective adversary might dwell. The Blackwood mirror and well served as conduits between these spaces, weakening the boundary. But we sealed the passage, I insisted. This particular passage, yes. But how many reflective surfaces exist in the world? How many still pools of water? How many mirrors with forgotten histories? Holmes shook his head. No, I do not think we have heard the last of such phenomena, though perhaps the Blackwood lineage is now free of its particular haunting. We sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, the fire crackling companionably in the grate. Finally, I voiced the question that had troubled me since our return. Holmes, how do we continue our work after experiencing such things? How do we return to investigating ordinary crimes when we know such extraordinary realities exist alongside our own? He considered this thoughtfully, with humility, Watson, with the understanding that our knowledge has limits, but that those limits need not be fixed. He tamped his pipe against the grate, and with the conviction that reason and observation remain our most reliable tools, even when confronting the seemingly inexplicable. A knock at the door interrupted our philosophical discussion. Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a telegram. "Just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, handing him the yellow envelope. Holmes opened it with his usual precision, scanning the contents quickly. His expression shifted from curiosity to keen interest. "It seems, Watson, that we may have opportunity to test our newly expanded worldview sooner than anticipated. This is from Detective Inspector Lestrade." "Another murder?" I asked already, reaching for my medical bag. "No," Holmes replied, a familiar spark of excitement returning to his eyes. "Something potentially more intriguing. a series of unexplained disappearances in Whitechapel. The victims reportedly vanished while passing by a particular shop window, leaving only their reflections behind. I felt a chill race down my spine. "Holmes, you cannot possibly think—" "I think nothing yet," he interrupted, already rising to retrieve his coat. "I merely observe that the game is afoot once more, and that it may lead us down passages both familiar and utterly new." As we descended the 17 steps to the street below, I could not help but glance apprehensively at the hall mirror we passed. For the briefest moment, I could have sworn my reflection lagged a fraction of a second behind my movement. But when I looked again, all appeared normal. Holmes, noting my hesitation, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Courage, Watson. If our experiences at Thornfield taught us anything, it is that even the most unearthly mysteries can be confronted with a clear mind and steadfast heart." With those words, we stepped out into the London fog, leaving Baker Street behind as we pursued yet another mystery into the gathering darkness. But this time, we carried with us a profound awareness that reality held more layers than we had previously imagined, and that sometimes the most dangerous truths lurked not in the shadows, but in the reflections of the everyday world around us. Behind us, forgotten in the empty sitting room, Holmes's pipe smoke drifted before the mirror above the mantelpiece. Had either of us remained to observe it, we might have noticed how the smoke's reflection moved in patterns utterly different from its source, almost as if stirred by an unseen hand reaching tentatively toward our world once more.